Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, people of the marketing and storytelling world. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. I'm a managing partner at the Digital Narrative Alliance, a new organization seeking to develop and deliver high quality digital transformation in marketing and storytelling information for professionals across the industry. And I'm joined, we're very fortunate to be joined today by Brian Solis, an old friend and a best-selling author of books about business transformation. Today we're going to be talking about Brian's journey from through several of his books, actually. What's the Future of Business and X, the experience when business meets design in particular, which is essentially a blueprint for the rethinking of business organizations around engagement. And Brian, thanks very much for joining us today. How are you?
Well, Mitch, I'm doing well, and anything to hang out with you. I have always admired your work and your thinking, so it's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Well, I remember being at a demo conference together and standing on the show floor talking about. In fact, I think it was a Bono impersonator who walked up to us and tried to convince us he was Bono.
Oh my gosh, I remember that. I don't even want to know what year that was, but yes.
A long time ago. So Brian, tell us a little about X. What's the basic premise, and let's just start with what the basic premise, and what are people going to be getting when they open this book and read through it?
Yeah, the premise is this, is that we're all talking about experiences, we're all talking about storytelling, and when it comes down to it, I think those are two terms that we don't necessarily grasp as well as we could, and they're also so important in that they're emotional, or they could be, and they could be very powerful as a result. And I had noticed over the years that when we use those terms, and just talk about marketing or engagement in general, we do so at a level that isn't as deep as it could be. And as a result, we end up talking at people or broadcasting at people, telling our stories, our messages, trying to push them upon people. And even though we may have the best of all intentions, X was about taking a step back and rethinking what an experience could be if you really wanted to connect with someone else, and then how to design that at scale, and using the book as almost a metaphor to show you what happens when the author does the same thing, so that we could help build an experience platform together.
So in a lot of ways, you're redefining the we that consists of the organization. The business itself has to rethink where its boundaries are, as I read the book. Is that a correct way to start thinking about this?
Yeah, there's so many, I'll tell you, there were so many iterations of this book as I came to grips with what I was really trying to say. And in many ways, I had to change who I am and how I do things as a result of trying to create an experience that I wanted somebody to have and share. And the parallel there was that it is also what organizations have to do, is that if you are really looking at being truly customer-centric, then you have to rethink how the company approaches customers and engagement and leads them through their journey and their life cycle. Because today it's incredibly siloed. We talk about that all the time, but it's fractured, it is another way to put it. And customers are becoming too sophisticated, too informed, too connected to tolerate these experiences. And they also are demanding to have personalization and service, and essentially the type of relationships with organizations that they have with some of their favorite apps, services, and even friends and social networks. Because to them, why should there be a difference? To them, they've conformed their entire life. You have a new generation of customers who don't even know what it's like to conform. So the reality is that, yes, if you want to compete for this new customer, this sophisticated, discerning customer, you do have to evolve. And that means that you might have to change how you're doing business, because the disruption that's happening in the industry, across all industries, is that new companies or progressive companies are figuring out how to do this differently. And if you're not doing so, you are immediately left behind, because once someone tastes an experience that they like or love, there's no going backward.
So you went through a lot of effort to come to these conclusions, and particularly I know that you wrote the book once and then rewrote it because you didn't feel it was correctly cast in order to get your point across. Talk about the challenge, well, your journey to understanding these insights and how you had to reconceptualize the business book for yourself as you wrote it.
I think you brought up a good point there, is that it wasn't getting my point across the way that I wanted to. And that was the first pitfall, was that I approached writing the book the way that any author really does, which is I have something to say. I'm very passionate about a particular topic, and therefore I'm going to share it with you. But that wasn't engagement as I was describing it or hoping to describe it or define it. That wasn't also experiential, in that it was much more one way than it was shared.
So you're sort of realizing you were talking at people too.
Yeah, exactly. It was, well, you know, that, and also I thought, wow, here it is, the irony of developing a book that teaches you how to define experiences in a digital economy in a book. And I thought it was not only ironic, but also selfish in a way, that I wasn't going to do anything differently except tell you how to do it differently. And I felt that it should be a shared journey, in that I should read the book in order to reimagine what a book could be for a digital economy, and then figure out who my reader was, and then how we could come through this journey together. And I'll tell you, though, that even after I came at it with the best intentions, I still approached it from a design standpoint, and not a bad way, and I'm sure we'll get to this later, but I employed UX and UI, and essentially a lot of approaches that you might take with web design, specifically in this case a mobile app, and then apply those insights to paper. And in doing so, I also was making a mistake, in that I was still trying to push a concept at people without necessarily taking into consideration the experiential component of it. So I had to sort of start again, in that I needed to understand how someone else experiences their favorite content, their favorite applications, what makes them engage more with information, more so what makes them share. And that, which, you know, is a rabbit hole that we could get into, is actually when I pressed pause on the development of X and wrote What's the Future of Business. So I actually shelved that book and wrote WTF beforehand, as a way of telling a better story in a new format.
So almost working it out for yourself, then working on the magnum opus that represented the full interpretation and action plan.
Yes, absolutely. So for those who have read WTF, or I hope you do, you'll notice that there is a similarity in the approach to design. WTF was my, let's just call it the beta test, in that I had already learned so many insights in terms of how the brain works with digital, and how someone navigates information on a mobile device, for example, and how you interact with that device from the home screen to the app, and across all of your favorite apps. And then within the apps, you know, what do you highlight? What do you share? What do you bookmark? And those insights led to what I'd like to call innovations in things like what a table of contents could be, how you structure chapters and flow, how you build a story arc with also engagement in mind, and also storytelling in mind. And the books, when you place WTF and X together, they are one grand story arc, and each in their own right individual story arcs. But it wasn't until X that I really had mastered well, I won't even say mastered, because I couldn't even get to everything I wanted to do within the book, but you could see that it's highly compartmentalized, streamlined in its language. And the little secret that we could come back to is, by the time I got to X, I had hired a Pixar storyboard artist to help me better understand the art of storyboarding.
And so that's fascinating. So you actually sat down with an artist and rebuilt this book visually in order to write the text.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I, in fact, scrapped much of the book right after I spent time with storyboard artists.
Well, so how does storyboarding change the telling of the story to you? Did it allow you to step back and view that your message in the context that you think that the audience was going to be able to take it in? Because, you know, we're talking about a time of incredible change right now. Business is accelerating, innovation or experimentation and discovery is accelerating. The fear of being left behind drives a lot of people to pay attention to things, but that isn't really the kind of engagement that keeps people there. You really broke this down into a set of important steps about achieving this first moment of truth, second moment of truth, and ultimate moment of truth in terms of the engagement of people along the way in the process. You've got essentially algorithms for engaging humans, and that's a really tough story to tell these days, because some people will come at it as, oh, this is a fad, or this is something just more fluff that is a distraction from moving forward, whereas other people who are really ready to change are looking for exactly this kind of information. Yet, as we know, both of us have been authors, and you certainly are more an author today than I am. Talking to that audience is challenging, and it does often come across as talking at them. But you've invited them into your head in a way using storyboarding. So when you sat with the storyboarder, how did you explain the ideas that were rolling around in Brian Solis's head?
Yeah, that, you know, I thought I understood storyboarding, and I thought I understood storytelling. I think this gets to the heart of really what we wanted to talk about, is that there's a difference in creative storytelling and human-centered storytelling, in that I can be creative, I can create something touching, funny, entertaining, entergaging, as some say, but it's difficult in that even if I get you to experience that content or that story and even share it, you move on. And right. It becomes an exercise in competing for attention. And that's, look, that's not going to go away. I think there's something, though, that I learned in this entire process. One was that there is competing for attention, and then there's competing for relevance, and they are not mutually exclusive, in that relevance correlates to value, and value correlates to something that's personal. And I can believe I'm communicating value, but until I understand what you value, until I understand what you're frustrated with or what your aspirations are, I can't create those threads, those deep links that will not just invite you into my head, but actually feel like I was putting words to the things that you were thinking, or that you were feeling, or that you were frustrated with, or that you dreamed of. And the only way to get there was for me to storyboard, and the only way that a storyboard could be successful is if you know who you're really trying to reach, and what a day in the life of is for them. And then more so, can you reverse engineer that into something that is believable and immersive, and that, you know, where they become part of the story. And I couldn't think of anybody better than someone who worked for Pixar, as I'm a big fan of Pixar and Disney, and I even tell the story of Disney in the book, where storyboarding evolved from Walt Disney's attempts to create Snow White, and it was I don't want to even say game-changing, it was a life-changing experience.
A lot of people forget that Walt Disney had to work really hard to get Snow White to be the visual experience he wanted to be. That's an important comparison to be thinking about today, because a lot of us And we hear about the tolerance for failure these days, but there's a lot of experimentation involved in getting to this kind of ongoing engagement that you're talking about. So what I saw in the book that was really interesting to me as a model for engagement is I could read a little bit of it, come back and take the next step when I had digested it. And in that sense, it was a lot like the software experience. And that's what I spend most of my time today doing, is designing software. And we do storyboarding at every step of the experience, from the beginning of a login to the end of the login, from the first time you use an app to the last time that you use an app, basically. And we hope that we continue bringing people back. The way that I take the X lessons myself is that we should be thinking about not closing off and answering all the questions that people have, but eliciting more of them in order to get greater and greater feedback to continue to tune the product or service to precisely what it is that audience is telling you they want, which also leads to greater customization and the opportunity to segment to do a better job by group or category. So it's also a path to greater efficiency, but it requires this first very important step of, as you say, stepping back and looking at the entire customer journey to begin with. Is that?
Yeah, in fact, I'm almost thinking that as you're talking about this, I'm visualizing the exact steps I went through in this process. So not to interrupt, but please continue.
No, go ahead. No, I'd love to hear what those exact steps. I mean, if you can talk about those, that's actually kind of where my question is driving, which is how did you come to this initial realization that business needed to change? Was there a company that you were working with, or a group of companies?
Well, my goodness, yeah. Well, my entire career has been pushing boulders up hills, going back to the early 90s, and that I don't know if I was just broken, or I don't know, that I just couldn't, I couldn't believe that the way that businesses were operating, as I started to see the internet become very profound in the lives of consumers and also businesses, I couldn't fathom that businesses weren't changing as I could watch people changing in their behaviors and ultimately their preferences and their values and beliefs as technology further permeated their lives over the years. Mm-hmm. And I just became infatuated with outside-in thinking as a way of inspiring internal change that had a purpose, not just changing for the sake of change, but changing because I could connect the dots between what and how we do things and why we do things to how markets were evolving. And this is very early on when I decided to start experimenting with digital anthropology, that when you look at cultures and norms and societies and values, and you tie that to decision making and influence and brand relationships and connections, there was indeed I don't know, not that I pretend to be any kind of genius, but I could almost visualize all of these things happening much in the same way that a chess player might be able to visualize the board after a series of moves without even having to make those moves. Mm-hmm. And that became incredibly difficult in that I couldn't communicate what I was seeing to other people in order to spark or rally change around it. I just sort of expected that people would see it too. And that became the impetus for me over the years to better understand storytelling as a means of getting people to support the idea of change, because they could see that from their own very being that it was the right thing to do.
You know, that's a theme that we investigated at the last Narrative Summit that the Digital Narrative Alliance had in November, which was the difference between, or the distinction between, story and narrative. A lot of people use them completely interchangeably. But narrative is really the context, the set of values, the expectations and assumptions that people bring to things that they consume in media. So, and you can see that those many different narratives in play in the vast separation of perception of the media, of what's the truth in the country and in the world these days, because people are coming from it from very different narrative structures. They've got assumptions that don't match one another, and yet the stories, the actual recounting of events, are for all intents and purposes facts. Depending on how completely you report them, of course, there's variation there, but you have a set of facts presented against this context, and if the context and the facts don't line up or create a real dissonance, you get a lot of struggle. And so I think, again, what you did that was really brilliant with X was bring the reader out of many of their normal assumptions and show them how to test them, this outside-in thinking that you're talking about. And how would you, if somebody stops you on the street, Brian, and says, how do I start thinking outside in? How would you give them, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, I tell the story of our good friend Chris Youre here, because he really blew my mind one day when we were in Sweden many, many years ago, in that we were just simply sitting around having lunch, talking with a few early pioneers in the social world, and he was explaining how people tend to attack the wrong problem, in that in the creative process, we're often told to think outside of the box. And what he explained was that really what that does is put people in another box, because we really haven't changed the rules of the game. And so if somebody stopped me on the street and said, hey, what do I need to do to take that outside thinking? It's assume nothing. It's get out of the way and use the people you're trying to reach as your inspiration, and start with the blank canvas. I know that sounds hard, but it is absolutely more difficult than to try to be creative with your assumptions and processes that you have today and try to get a different result. It's expensive. You're going to take a lot of time, and you're never going to achieve the type of results than what you would get at in a counterintuitive way, which is, what if I could start from scratch? Right. And that's exactly where the inspiration comes in, because you're forced to see people in a different light. And the entire book, in its own way, and I hope to do this in the future as well, is I don't introduce a new idea to you until I've brought you into a safe zone. And so every time I introduce a new idea, I've hopefully brought you in a place where you're ready to hopefully see it without bias, without assumptions, to be ready to learn. And I get that absolutely limits the book's potential reach, in that it's not, hey, everybody, you're the best and we can do this together, but instead it's unlearning and learning as a matter of design, as a matter of storytelling, as a matter of experience, something that we could do together. And I used UX and UI principles as a means to bring that to life. But I'll tell you that the hardest part was the unlearning for myself, and to see that I was indeed not capable of answering that question for someone else until I had to break down all of my processes and assumptions and standards, and that Mitch, was the hardest part.
So do you have an unlearning board where you keep track of what you should keep unlearned?
I should. You'd think I would, actually. I do, in the context of what I did around this book. I kept a journal so that I could apply, so that I could build upon it for the next book. But in this regard, I kind of feel like I'm still unlearning and also learning. And it's, to be completely honest, it's not a comfortable place to be. It's very comfortable when you think you know everything and you build a career on that, and you keep kind of moving iteratively, ladder rung by ladder rung. But this, I still couldn't tell you that I've mastered any bit of storytelling at all. I just know what I would follow in terms of trying to tell the next story. And I guess that's when it becomes most human, is when it's driven by the intent or the purpose to tell something that's not only believable but experiential to someone who's looking for and ready for an experience, whether they know it or not.
So this is a great place to stop for a moment, and I'm going to put up a poll for the folks who are watching to just ask you all about what kind of storytelling you're using in your organization. And it's open now, so if you would take a moment and answer, that would be fantastic. So and do feel free, by the way, to add your questions. We can take questions, and I certainly will be happy to pass them along to Brian. Um, what you're talking about with regard to it's not a comfortable place to be, but it is the new place that we're going as organizations. For the entire industrial era, we would get a business process in place and hope to ride it as long as possible without a lot of disruption. And so we have people now who are disturbed by the fact that their entire career has become obsolete because they didn't really continue to iterate that. And I don't mean that to sound as cold as it might sound to a lot of folks, but it is a matter of deciding to continue to evolve rather than to decide to stop and rest. And you posted something on LinkedIn about 3-4 weeks ago that essentially said this as bluntly as I've seen, which is that once you start digital transformation, it just never ends. That it is the ride or the journey that philosophically we're supposed to enjoy simply for the enjoyment of it, but it's also the state of the human existence right now, that we're in a time of rapid change, so that digital transformation is also, if you can embrace it like you would embrace an exercise regime, a great way to keep yourself moving forward, both as a career in your own career or as an organization, because you're forcing that constant outside-in thinking that will readjust what's going on inside the organization. Now, as you think over the client engagements and the like, how do you get people, when you're in person with them, to first take those steps? What would you say to an executive who called, not the guy on the street, but the executive who calls and says, I need help with changing my company? Where do you suggest they start?
Oh, I would like to pretend that I have a go-to answer for that. I've helped companies change over the last 20 plus years, and I still think I'm learning as I do it. The one thing is to better understand what are they trying to do. I don't know that change for the sake of change is as productive as we'd like, but I do know that change with purpose is when things really become tangible. Personally, I like to think about it this way. If you're just trying to be competitive, that's not enough. If I can help whomever is asking me understand what it means to be competitive and why, and really start to get to the questions using basic social science approaches from psychology and what have you, that really get to the root, into the heart of the matter, and then I always say that I'm not just a digital analyst, I'm also a therapist, just by default, in really trying to hear people out and understand where they're trying to be, why they aren't content where they are, what their challenges are, what their obstacles are, and struggles, and really get that story out. By the time we're done, I have such a real meaningful conversation with them that I now then could have some real advice about what the next step is. Often, though, what I tend to do before I start giving advice is say, let me talk to other key stakeholders in the organization, because I probably would have heard a lot of things about digital transformation which we don't talk about enough, and which is at the heart of my research, which is the human side of digital transformation. I believe that out of every story of innovation or change or even failure, there are real human elements to that. I call it the human quotient, that don't come to light. So, for example, as the therapist, I say that with a smirk, the therapist in me, as I'm doing this research, I'll find things like egos and politics and sabotage and fear and misinformation, all kinds of things that are actually at the heart of this. And what we're really talking about is, hey, Brian, when I need to change, I need to compete in a digital economy, I need to digitally transform. What do I do? Where do I start? Well, that could be an internal issue that we have to resolve first before we could build upon a broken foundation, or that could be, that employee engagement or employee experiences are completely broken, or that HR is, rooted in the 1960s and we're trying to compete in the 2020s, and it could be all of those things. But I can't move the company forward until I could play that back for them in a way that everybody, not just one person, but everybody can nod their head and say, yeah,
So there's a
I get it.
storytelling element to that too.
Oh, storytelling. Once you learn the art of storytelling, and I can't emphasize enough about learning about storyboarding as a practice, because it sort of forces you to really think about all of these things, is that nothing can be without believability and purpose, and change is surely one of them. Just like data. I mean, data could reinforce your own biases. Artificial intelligence could reinforce broken, inhumane engagements,
Sure.
but with the right storytelling in all of these fronts, with the human quotient sort of driving all of those, everything takes on a different dimension.
So we have a question from Barbara Frontera, who's on the call, and she's asking, what do you do since we're still fighting the one-and-done mentality that pervades most organizations? So let me recast that just a little bit and say, so if somebody came to you and said, we want to do digital transformation, we've got 6 months, and when we're done, we want to be done, and that's it. Is that an engagement you would even consider taking, or does it betray such a gap between the readiness for ongoing change and today's state that you would try to avoid it?
To be honest with you, I, at its most ingrained level, have stepped back from consulting, so that I could, because engagements like this are months long. They're incredibly emotional.
Yep.
And what I tried to do was do the research, both from an analytical perspective and also an anthropological perspective, to empower people to become, I don't want to say become me, but become the instruments of change within their organization, whether that's leading it internally or leading it through consultancies or steering committees, to have the information that they need without having to spend years and years and years of changing organizations like I've done. So with that said, yes, every bit of false assumptions or stated practices or standards that are eroding or aged are going to stand in your way. That is a no-brainer, and there are levels of sort of maturity that come out of that. Are people open-minded already because they're seeing it around them, or that they're feeling the pain or the pressure because of lost market share, like, say, someone in the retail environment, for example? There's a lot of ways to come to that, and I do a lot of fact-finding and soul-searching coming into that. But yeah, it's the practice in general that gets in the way of a lot of this. So the one-and-done mentality, I talk about that in X, where you can't tell a good story without a story, at least building it into a story arc, or like you were talking about, sort of the narrative, right? But none of that's going to mean anything if the story sucks. And none of that's going to get anywhere if the story arc itself is flipped. And that, I think, is the problem with marketing in general, is that the story arc starts backwards, in that everything's campaign driven. Everything is, here's our budget, here's the story and the narrative, and go. And you essentially start backwards, where you're at the top of the arc. Hey, listen to us, oh my gosh, we're so awesome, and then we're gone, we're out of money.
So based on the poll results, which are up on the screen right now, everybody, we are looking at an audience that represents pretty much the divided world. 27% say yes, they're using a shared mission and engagement through story in their organizations. 18% say yes, but we're still figuring out how to do it. 18% say we're interested, but we're still just exploring, and 36% say no, we still rely on documentation, email, conversations, campaign plans to manage this. And to your point, if you don't have the sequel that is the next interesting step to take, you really have spent an awful lot of money to get a lot of attention, but not really engaged the people whose attention you have past that immediate investment. And again, this is what we're talking about in the next narrative summit, is the idea that stories must change. The Gutenberg era approach was an authoritative copy of a story. You know, you knew you had the best version of Homer, even though Homer had been verbally passed on for about 1,000 years before it was even written down. You had this strange idea you had the definitive copy during the book era. Now that we're moving past these closed, fixed physical artifacts, the story is something that can be used to move the audience forward, also to bring the audience into the co-design of products and services. So, Brian, as you think about where you want to take the X experience, and you and I have had some separate conversations about this, and we don't need to go too far into it, but what would you like X to be able to achieve for people, and how is that defining your evolving brand?
Well, before I answer that fully, I'll just say I don't know the answer to that. X was a very life-changing experience. X and WTF, because it was essentially they're tangible versions of the exact things that they're meant to teach. And we also live at a time when truth and fact are now debated.
Yep.
And I am learning how to find some sense of shared values, interests, and aspirations where you can find truth that takes on multiple dimensions that can connect with people in ways that are personal. In that there is no audience anymore. There's a distributed sense of audiences that have a filter up that requires relevance in order to permeate that, which changes the entire game, and it's going to continue to change. And that's equally challenging as it is awesome in the truest sense of what awesome means. I am learning how to do this. I'm constantly experimenting, and what I hope to do with X is to open people's minds, to bring them down a journey that means that I'm not the only one that has to answer these questions. I think together we can find ways to make things more relevant, but also influential. For example, one of the things that I experimented with, or wanted to experiment with in this last election, was bringing in the younger voices through their channels to speak about the shared vision and shared destination that they had in the ways that they were going to vote, to bring those people who shared those ideals and ideas together along the way. At the same time, I was looking at building a technology platform with a good friend of mine that was essentially going to create a series of bots to combat the bots, right? You can't even get to the point of truth and fact if you can't at least strip away or at least bring doubt to the mistruths that were pervasive.
Right.
And it was a very interesting experiment in what we never got off the ground because we just honestly couldn't financially afford it, and the resources necessary to do it as quickly as we needed to do it before the election happened was just too great. And I'm still trying to do it today because, as we can see, we've not gotten any better as a result. But the insights that have come out of this have been really incredible for what I would do with my next book and what I continue to do with my own research and with my own writing, with my own medium, whether that medium would be, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, whether it's a traditional article. So where I'm trying to get to with X is this shared sense of purpose that it is a platform for which you can learn how to do things differently and apply that to whatever you want. It could be how you tell your corporate story. It could tell how you tell your product story. It could tell how you tell your data story. It could tell how you talk to people within your organization to bring about change, but doing so experientially, where it's not just you delivering an experience to someone, it's delivering an experience someone values. Because people are going to always have an experience in any moment, in any engagement. And once I have your attention, you have my attention, what's going to happen next? So I hope to build this out into something that you and I have talked about to be something a little bit more immersive, something a bit more continual, something that helps build a generation of what we can call experience architects, that they could apply that to any level of work, CX, EX, HR, you name it, anything really, where storytelling becomes an experience, becomes part of any mix. But that's to say that I think what I might do for my personal brands, long way around, coming back to your question, the natural thing that I wanted to do was continue sort of the sense of what experience design would be. I might take a break from that, because the number one question I'm getting from everyone is, how do I get people to change their perspective?
Yeah.
And how do I truly innovate at a time where at best we're iterating within the organization, because I can't get people to change their path or their vision or their perspective. And I might take a break from that, the continuum I'm on, to help address that, because that'll hopefully, I mean, not that one book will solve the world's challenges.
Not many one books do that. You're right.
But hopefully, again, with that, it would be something in that we become stronger together, and we create a community together where it makes the belonging matters, because we do something together that changes the world.
You know, that raises an interesting question vis-a-vis your discussion of bringing young voters in to talk about why they were voting the way they were. I see a lot of concentration in engagement around generations, and the current hope is millennials will change everything, and that the following generations will do even more. But we've also been living that way for a long time, and it seems that one of the industrial era things we lost was multi-generational missions. And it's been interesting. There are several experiments like you were talking about that I saw during the election. One grad student did this wonderful thing where you could sign up to have a phone conversation or an in-person conversation with a voter from the other side of the divide. The funny thing was that thousands, like 10,000 right-wing voters signed up hoping to have those conversations, and 10 liberals did. And on another example, I'm going to mangle the story, so I won't try to tell it. But what I've seen is there's a growing awareness of multi-generational stakes, organizations that want to survive longer than the next 10 years, to outlive the average S&P 500 company, which is only on the S&P 500 typically for about 8 years these days. All of this points to us having to pull together to create bigger senses of shared concern and commitment to various things. And we know that millennials and younger voters and younger people are very values driven. How do you see the capture of values? That is, if you were to survey the marketplace to understand the values driving the perception of your brand, is that an area that you think would be rich in terms of mining insight at this point? And if that's the case, how would you go about starting that?
That's pretty deep. I found myself listening, and this is, I always say that, you know, it sounds like mom's advice, but the best listeners make the best conversationalists. And before I answer the question, you know, one of the things that I had observed as I was learning how to become a decent storyteller was that a lot of us listen with the intent to respond, and that sort of blocks a lot of what someone's trying to tell someone else or share with someone else. And it's really important to listen more than ever before. And in that, I'll take sort of the answer on, you know, look, I think a lot of people feel like their perspective is the right perspective. How couldn't you see it the other way? And it's because many people aren't taking the time to see the world from an empathetic standpoint, or to see the world through the eyes of someone else. To give you what I hope is not a charged answer, but or an example, but you know, Sam Altman spent a lot of time. Sam Altman is running Y Combinator, which is a startup incubator in Silicon Valley that led to the creation of some of the world's most valuable companies and most successful startup stories recently. And he, after the election, took a tremendous time off work to travel around Middle America to have just discussions with people who voted for Trump to better understand what drove them to that decision. And it was eye-opening what he came back with. And I think he wanted to do so because he needed to understand what had happened, but also I think he has his eye on maybe having positive impact through changing politics in the future. And that's just an assumption of mine. But
well, actually, the story broke today that he's going to run for mayor of San Francisco.
Oh, interesting. I hope that's I hope that's true in that. Well, I hope it's true for the right reasons, and I won't comment on that. I got to go do my homework. But
it's a good response.
Yeah, it's nice to see when people listen, and I did the same thing, around some of the southern states in the Midwest, and I was very much awakened to different ideas. I did discover ways that you could bring people to the middle, but you can't assume people are going to come all the way to your side, and I think a lot of people sort of assume that. I can see that all over Facebook, especially when people try to push their perspectives onto people or their beliefs and our ideals. But storytelling, I think, is as much about understanding other people as it is learning how those insights can build bridges into new places, because I don't think yanking people to one side or the other is the point of any of this. Sure. I think that means that we have to, as storytellers, be ready to leave where we're standing right now.
So, and this is a question that came from Gary Selleck in the audience. Given what you've been through, the years of study and commitment you've put into this, what strategies and approaches do you find useful in helping everyday managers use storytelling and narrative effectively? It sounds like maybe starting by listening is part of the answer, but what would you say?
Managers are the toughest in that they're in a position within the organization in that they're supposed to enforce existing standards and processes. That's their entire job. And those processes and systems and hierarchies and metrics have been around for a really long time. And even if it's a newer company, that management infrastructure is borrowing from traditional and legacy models that are in many ways not as productive if you want to apply outside-in thinking. A way to do that is to break all assumptions, to say that you have people won't see that they're part of the problem until you can do so in a creative, non-threatening way, to say, you ever notice that when we have these meetings that some people are sort of afraid to speak up, that those who are a bit higher on the totem pole tend to sort of emphasize their perspectives or ideas and sort of get into this recurring cycle. What if we came to this in a way that, say, for example, David Bray at the FCC comes to this, and where as a manager he just sort of puts out on the table that he's not the only solutions provider, and that he does real creative things to empower the workforce, to bring new ideas, to bring new things to the table that sort of shape what that story could be. And if you just Google David Bray FCC, you'll find a lot of really fascinating stories about how he empowers folks. There's also a podcast I did, if you Google my name and David Bray, where he just reveals everything that he did to answer this particular question. But my personal experience is that managers are part of the direct problems just simply by design of their role. I have this saying that
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Mitch.
I was going to say, doesn't that suggest that the roles need to change?
Yeah, absolutely.
The manager needs to change?
Absolutely. I think the cases where I see digital transformation happening, whether storytelling or not, is when people realize that they actually can't function in their role the way it was designed, that they have to join forces with others like them in order to move forward collectively without the answers, but strength in numbers to get those answers and to essentially seek the information that helps them move forward in new directions, right? So, for example, the connected consumer is counterintuitive to many of the processes that exist today, but they wouldn't know that until they start studying not only the customer journey, but, for example, where the journey is broken, or looking at specific nuances like micro moments or mobile journeys in an ideal world, looking at the customer journeys of, so if you're a retailer, what would the customer journey be for somebody like Dollar Shave Club versus your store? And, kind of getting out of your own mind, your own, industry. And then what I was going to say earlier is that, you can't get there if you continue to follow the same routines that you do every single day. You have to break those routines in some way, shape, or form in order to unlock new possibilities. And the saying was that, I tried to be creative once, but I got stuck in meetings all day.
Yes, I do know that feeling. So another question from the audience. Have you seen examples, and could you provide maybe a couple, where you've seen storytelling or stories used to create greater alignment in organizations you've worked with or studied?
Yeah, well, the David Bray example, I think, is one good one. I think the one I always like to tell are, and they've been a part of my research, are Starbucks and also Sephora, in that you can't tell a story unless you actually know what the story is and why that story is so compelling. But more so, and this is, I can't tell you this example specifically, but I will tell you what I've learned in my research and in my practice, is that you have to assume that when someone's listening, they don't have the benefit of the insight and the experience you have coming to that moment. They're going to listen to you with a preconceived bias. It's just natural. They're going to be listening for the things that connect with them as it relates to their beliefs, their experience, and their motivations, or their pressures. So understanding that, whether that's companies that you're trying to change or whether that's audiences you're trying to engage, people have their own predispositions. Same is true for a relationship, by the way. This could be fantastic marriage counseling or relationship counseling as well. But you have to speak in ways that, which means you have to know who you're talking to.
Sure.
And tell your story in a way that's going to be relatable to that individual or that group of individuals in a way that's different. So you have to cater your story to them. And it's counterintuitive in that, but then again, so is everything that I've learned in storytelling, in that you expect other people to just sort of latch onto the great things you've learned or the passions you've found or the inspirations you've found. Where that's possible, the energy is contagious, but you have to align it to the way someone hears things. So with that said, Starbucks did this by looking at sort of what we know. The world is becoming more digital. We know the world's becoming more mobile. What could Starbucks become in a mobile world? And what don't we know in order to start getting to what we do know and then what we could do about it? And for them, they really looked at startups and mobile apps that were really gaining traction and trying to take those insights into developing both a mobile app, but also the mobile physical relationship that's created all kinds of happy problems that they have today. And on another quick note, Sephora did this by studying their user. How has things like Instagram changed the concept of beauty, or social media changed the concept of beauty, and how does that change how they shop for what they need, and how do we change the retail and the online environment to engage somebody of this digital mindset? So they really went to get the answers that answered questions that they weren't asking before, and that, I think, is where great storytelling can begin.
And that, again, sounds like listening and becoming conversant in the language, the expectations and values of that audience, so that you are able, even if you want to change it, you meet them on their ground, and then you expand that territory together. Would you say that is a good way of starting?
Yeah, absolutely. I think listening is, again, listening with the intent to learn and to shape a new impression or perception is really what it's about, instead of just listening to, as a way of being polite or courteous to someone else, and also let it touch you. Let it challenge your own conventions. Mm-hmm. You're not going to get. I always say you can't open new doors with old ways. Just like you can't tell great stories, you can't earn relevance if you haven't started asking different questions. Otherwise, you're just going to come to things that get you on the path of iteration, which is doing the same things better, rather than innovation, which is doing new things that unlock new values.
Brian, I think that's a great place to wrap this discussion up because it does put a bow on precisely the issue that we at the Digital Narrative Alliance believe is the key to moving forward, which is to find this narrative space and start to explore it with the people who are going to live through the story you're describing. That's true in organizations that are delivering consumer products. It's also true of organizations in politics or with seeking to make a social impact, nonprofits. I think we're at the beginning of a profound 15 to 20 years of optimization of the business world, and X is a fantastic guidebook for beginning that journey for anybody listening today or on the archival broadcast, which we are planning on releasing of this as well. So I want to thank everybody for joining. There are two handouts attached to the webinar interface. One is a list of all of Brian's books if you'd like to download that. It includes links so you can buy them. The other is a description of the Narrative Summit 3, Stories That Change, which takes place on June 20th, 2017 at the UCSF Mission Bay Conference Center in San Francisco. We're going to be talking with some fantastic speakers, including Scott Burns, who was the producer of An Inconvenient Truth and the screenwriter of The Bourne Ultimatum and one of my favorite Matt Damon films, The Informant. Also, Ann Pendleton Julian, who will be talking about her new book and 5-volume set of work on the future of design with John Seeley Brown. The book is called Pragmatic Imagination, and the 5-volume set will be called Design Unbound when it's released later this year. We also have Tom Bedekar, who was the founder of AKQA, one of the most important ad agencies in the Bay Area. Barry Johnson, who is a former Economic Development Advisor to the U.S. Department of Commerce, who is now doing filmmaking on marginalized people, and Luis Saihoyos, who was the director of The Cove, the movie that blew open the controversy around tuna fishing and dolphin kills in Japan. Going to be a fantastic day, and I'm looking forward to having all of you who are listening today attend. And Brian, unfortunately, you're going to be out of town, but it would be fabulous to have you there, and we'll have you at the next one.
Absolutely. I look forward to it.
Thank you very much, Brian, for your time today.
Oh, thank you, and thank you, everybody, for being part of this. You know, we're together. We can do greater and greater things, and we just have to learn from one another in order to get there.
Well, I couldn't agree more. Let's do it, and I'm looking forward to our next conversation. This is the Digital Narrative Alliance's first webinar on these topics, and look forward to many more. We're about to kick off a major new initiative around storytelling, and we hope you'll come along with us. Thanks, Brian. Thank you, everybody who's listening. We'll see you soon.